In celebration of May as National Historic Preservation Month, the Arlington Historical Society, the county's Historic Preservation Program Office, and Preservation Arlington are excited to present the second workshop about how to research your historic house in Arlington. My name is Liccese-Torres, and I am the county's Historic Preservation Program Coordinator. I began my career with the county in 2001 as a preservation planner and have been serving as the Preservation Program Coordinator since 2013. Over the years, I have researched dozens of historic properties in Arlington. When I first started researching here, I unfortunately had to figure out all the different places to go and what to look for all on my own. So lucky for you that I am now sharing all of my trade secrets to make your research projects a little bit easier. In this workshop, you will learn insider's tips about how to research the history of your own home, neighborhood, and historic properties in general throughout the county. I will share 2 case studies of 2 very different historic houses as a way to walk you through the various steps of the research process. Afterwards, please be sure to visit the Center for Local History at Central Library to explore some of the historic maps, building permit data, photo archives, and other materials that you will learn about today. To pique your curiosity, here is a quick look at the 2 historic houses being featured as case studies. The first is Broadview, a single-family residence built in 1881 in what is now the Waycroft Woodlawn neighborhood off Washington Boulevard and North George Mason Drive, not far from Virginia Hospital Center. This one-of-a-kind home began as a modest traditional I-house that expanded multiple times over the decades and evolved into one of the most high-style examples of the Queen Anne style in the county. The current property owners asked the county board to consider their house for local historic district designation. In November 2014, Broadview's designation request was approved, thereby protecting it for generations to come by a special zoning overlay and a design review process for future exterior changes. In comparison, the Lustron home, formerly located in the Virginia Heights neighborhood at the corner of South Frederick Street and 12th Street South, dated to 1949. It was one of nearly 2,500 all-steel, prefabricated Lustron homes built nationwide, and was one of 11 in Arlington and one of 5 in this neighborhood alone. In 2006, the owner of this house graciously donated it to Arlington County on the condition that it be removed from his lot. So the county carefully labeled and documented the house before having it disassembled and stored. It took a brief journey to the Big Apple in 2008 and was featured in an exhibit on prefabricated architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, and then it returned briefly to storage again here in Virginia. In 2011, the Arlington County Board donated the house to the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus, which has since been renamed the Ohio History Connection. In essence, it returned home to its birthplace, just a short distance from the original Lustron factory. You can now tour the house, which is on display as an interactive exhibit at the Ohio History Connection until 2018, and see how a typical American family would have lived in the 1950s. Now, let's join the workshop I conducted for the Arlington Historical Society, which took place at the Arlington Central Library. I hope that you enjoy it. So I wanted to get started with talking about some of the basics that you need to know. My first recommendation is that when you get started, start with the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why. Start by figuring out the facts that you already know about your property, and then making a list of the things that you're trying to figure out. And secondly, it's important to train your eyes to look for the details. Whether you're trying to figure out how a property evolved over time, or if you're looking up old deed or census records, pay attention. You never know what clues you might find in any step of the process. Don't hesitate to come up with theories of your own to help you try to solve the puzzles. Sometimes you'll prove yourself wrong before you make all the pieces fit together. Historic research is indeed a process, so I would encourage you just to be patient and embrace the story as it unfolds to you. This evening, we're going to walk through the different types of historic research sources that are available here in the county. We'll look at county building permit and tax records, old maps and photos, land and probate records from the courthouse, census records, and other information that you can find online, as well as at the library and then from the buildings themselves. There are some noticeable differences, though, in the types and the quantity of information we can get from all of these different sources. So we'll also talk about how to make the best use of the most obvious information and how to keep working to solve the puzzles. It's the more pre-work that you can do before you actually head out to a repository, the better, because then that way you can figure out how you can divide and conquer and best use your time. So as I mentioned, we'll be looking at resources at the county courthouse, the main county building at Courthouse Plaza, here at the Central Library and the Center for Local History, as well as various sources that you can find online. In the slides, and you have copies of all of them in your packets, I've also tried to include where I could different hours of operation, addresses, websites, and things like that, so you won't have to take as detailed notes. So using just your current property address or the address of the property you're interested in, or using the names of the current property owner, you can easily go to the courthouse and look up things like deeds, mortgages, and wills. There are computers available in the land records room on the 6th floor, or you can search the microfilm there, or you can even lug out the heavy deed books like I prefer to do. And if you have specific questions about how to do deed research or any of the things that we're going to be talking about, please try to save your questions to the end, and I'm happy to try to address whatever comments you have. So in addition to the county courthouse building, I want to talk a little bit about some of the resources that are at the main county building at Courthouse Plaza. In that building on the 7th floor in Suite 700, you'll find our Office of Historic Preservation. You can come anytime. We'd prefer you make an appointment just to make sure that one of us is there to help you. But we have thousands of architectural survey records on thousands of buildings in dozens of neighborhoods here in the county. We also have a wonderful collection of maps, and a lot of the maps that we have you can also find here at the library. But we also have our own vertical file type collection where everything that we have is based by property address, but we might have newspaper clippings, student reports, photographs. There's really quite a range of things that we might have, and I think a lot of people don't realize that we are a resource. I also wanted to mention my colleagues in the Department of Environmental Services, which are on the 8th floor of the county building, and there you can find different types of subdivision plat maps. You can find drawings and maps related to the county's roadways, utilities, and when those were installed, things of that nature. I could probably dedicate an entire workshop just on the goodies that you are going to see in a little bit here at the Center for Local History. And on this slide, I've given you just a sample of the types of resources that you can find here at the center. And given my firsthand experience doing research here, I promise you that if John, Judy, and Heather, who are seated in the back of this room, can't find what you're looking for, then it probably does not exist. Some of these items that are listed here we'll go over in a bit, and you'll be able to see some of these things too after my talk, and you're able to go visit the center for yourselves. I did want to highlight a few of the very important resources that the center has, including their collection of neighborhood directories, phone books, and city directories like Hills, Polks, and Haynes that date throughout the 20th century. The center also has a wonderful photograph collection of people and places, an index scholarly journal that was done by the Arlington Historical Society and gets added to every year. And they also have a fascinating community archives of local ephemera on a wide variety of topics, from civic association records to church records to business records. There's quite a wide range. And then there are some things like building permit records that you can only find here at the library. And then there are some resources such as the federal census and some of the newspapers that you can look at both here as well as online. And you can do that for free simply by just using your library card. Some of the historic newspapers they have in their collection include the Evening Star, the Alexandria Gazette, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. But every day it seems like there's more and more types of information that are available online. And I tried to give you a list of very helpful links, so to be sure to check them out to try to further your research. You have easy access to online Arlington County tax records, as well as historic maps and the federal census, as I mentioned before. If you're not familiar with it and you haven't done so already, be sure to visit the county's GIS Mapping Center on the county's website, because there you can look at aerial photographs over time. You can also look at historic property maps, Civil War era maps, so there's quite a collection. And there are also quite a detailed collection of histories about Arlington neighborhoods, especially those that are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. You can find these not only on the State Historic Preservation website, but also on the county website. And many of Arlington's neighborhood conservation plans that are done through the planning department have their own neighborhood history sections, and so those are another often overlooked source of historic information. It's also worth mentioning that research possibilities are seemingly endless. Don't forget you can reach out to family members as well as long-term neighbors, former owners of your property, and consider checking out these additional sources here, such as the Library of Congress, the Social Security Death Index, as well as the Library of Virginia, to really try to round out your search. So now I wanted to focus on the 2 historic properties to kind of walk you through how you would go about tackling this on your own. So first we'll start with Broadview. And just so you know, in the early 20th century, this property contained over 220 acres, and now the house sits on just less than 1/3 of an acre. It was built in 1881 for Robert Stinson Lacey and stayed within their family until 1937. As I mentioned, it originally contained only 4 rooms, but several different additions were added to the house over time as the needs and social status of the family allowed. The house has a beautiful stone foundation, original wood siding, a prominent 3-story tower, and decorative gingerbread trim. The house itself retains a very high level of historic integrity. It is architecturally significant for its representation of the Queen Anne style, and it's historically significant for its association with Robert Lacey, who was a patent lawyer, a Civil War veteran, and a superintendent for the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in Lynchburg. Locally, Lacey also operated one of Arlington County's largest farms and was very active in political and social affairs. And in November of 2014, Broadview became one of our locally protected historic properties. Completing a request for local designation is a lengthy process, as you might imagine. But luckily, thanks to John Lieberts, who serves on the historic preservation staff, I was able to pull a lot of his photographs and maps and other images that he compiled to be able to share with you. So here are a few historic images of Broadview from the early and mid 20th century. Thankfully, both the former and the current owners willingly shared a lot of their photographs with us to help us figure out some of the clues when trying to understand how this complex property evolved. So here we have then, and here's how it is now. You can see the series of additions in both the top and bottom images, plus some of the architectural details in the upper right of the slide. The bottom right illustration was done by John to help explain the various construction phases of the house. And believe it or not, the earliest section is the smallest piece shown in red, and while the other stages indicate, according to all the research that we were able to do, approximately when all the other parts of the house were constructed. So what kind of records did we analyze to help us figure out all those different stages, you might be wondering? So here's an example of what we call the county's house cards. And the one I've shown you here is the house card for Broadview. Essentially, the house cards are the way we tracked all of the old historic building permit information. And depending on the date of the property and depending on when these cards were filled out, you could get a wide range of information on these cards. But they give us a lot of very important clues, and these include construction permit dates and numbers, as well as alterations that happened over time. These are really invaluable and would be very helpful to you, but the key to using them is you need to have a current property address, because that's how all of these are searchable. For this particular card, you can see the date that the card was completed up in that upper right corner, plus the owner's name at the time and the property address. And unfortunately, there's not much else on here. This is because Broadview dates to the late 19th century, and these cards were not created or required until 1935, when we had our very first building code. And here are 2 historic maps that I wanted to show you about. The 1878 Hopkins map is on the left, and is a wonderful map that shows not only building locations and owner names, but it also indicates major roadways, the railroads, and even some water features. The red arrow on the map at the left indicates the future location of the Broadview property. And then the 1900 landowner map on the right was done by the Virginia Title Company, and it's one of my favorite county historic maps. We fight over the office copy all the time, whose office is it in. You can even see this particular map on the county's GIS website. So if you're looking up your property, you can put this map on as an overlay, and so you can see what your street, what your neighborhood looked like back in 1900. And in case you were curious, just so you know, Arlington's current street naming system wasn't adopted until 1934. So if your house predates that, your original address would have been something very different than what it is now. And I know the Center for Local History does have an index that has all of the old street names and then what the new ones are, in case you're curious. John and my staff created this map for the Broadview Historic District Designation Report, and I included it here to show you just what I mentioned, how you can use this as an overlay with the current GIS map data. So now, if you look closely, there's a little yellow polygon right there in the middle. That's Broadview. And so you can see how the property has been subdivided and the neighborhood has changed over time. Other fabulous historic map resources that you can find here at the center include Sanborn fire insurance maps. The center has several volumes, and originals are also available at the Library of Congress. The larger image at the left shows Broadview back in 1936, so you could see not only its outbuildings, but also its surrounding land when the property still had its broad view. The right image is a close-up of this same map sheet, and I wanted to zoom into that to show you some of the symbols that you can find on these maps. You see the large letter D in the middle of the house indicates that this particular property was a dwelling, and the numbers that you see indicate the number of stories. The dashed line on the right side shows the location of the front porch, and at the beginning of this map book, there is a key that tells you what all the different symbols and things are. So make sure you check that out. As a point of comparison, here's another Sanborn map from a little bit later in time. This one's from 1959. And I wanted to show you this so you can see how the property has been subdivided as the surrounding neighborhood was built out. And so Broadview here is located inside the red circle. Here are two examples of historic aerial photographs from the collection on the county website. These are from 1934 on the left and 1983 on the right. You can pretty much search this collection of photographs by decade online via the GIS Mapping Center. Some years the images are a little clearer and a little fuzzier than others, but they're very important resources to help you piece together especially how a property might have evolved over time as well as its surroundings. Just as important and fascinating as learning about the physical history of a place is learning about the people who were associated with it. Who built the house? Who lived there over time? What were their occupations? What were their personal stories? I wanted to show you a few historic images John found of the Lacey family, who were the first owners of Broadview. Robert Lacey can be seen in the middle photo in the top right in the derby hat, and his niece Sally inherited the estate upon his death. And Broadview remained in the Lacey family until 1937. Some sources you might want to consider for discovering your own historic photos include previous owners and their occupants, the Center for Local History, as well as Ancestry.com, and that's where we found these pictures. Next, I wanted to take a moment to explain how to search the county's real estate assessment database. Using the web address that I've listed there on the right, you can glean important information about both historic and new properties. Pay special attention to the areas that I circled there in red, including the legal property description at the top, which will prove helpful when you're researching your old deeds at the courthouse. At the bottom, you will see a list of the most recent property owners, as well as the different property transactions, including the dates, the purchasers, and the corresponding deed book references. Be sure you take note of those deed book pages and numbers in advance of going to the courthouse, because that will save you a lot of time. This will easily get you started. And from these current real estate assessment records, you can also view historic tax information about your property. And to do that, I wanted to show you the first page from Broadview's property tax card. And to find this card for your property, simply go to the general information page on the search screen and click on the listing that says Archives Property Card, and you'll see that link on the left side of the screen. Although these property cards don't list every single transaction over the life of a property, they do have owners' names, deed book references, as well as property values from the 1950s forward. And this is the second page of that property card for Broadview, which gives a lot more information, including more deed references, as well as some information about the building itself. There's not that much filled out on this card, but oftentimes you can find things like building materials, square footage, and date of construction. Keep in mind, though, that any construction dates that you see on either these on these assessment records are simply just one point of reference for you. And I say this with caution, especially if you have a property that predates that 1935 building code. In the case of Broadview, on this card, it says that the house was built in 1900, but that we know that by looking at historic maps and deeds and other materials, we were able to date the house prior to that. So we'll talk soon about how researching a newer historic property is a little easier. So once you've taken note of the different transactions for your property and have your deed book references handy, the next logical step on your search would be to visit the county courthouse, where you can look up deeds, mortgages, and will records. Here is a sample deed from the Broadview property. And I know it's hard to read and you don't really need to know what all the fine print says. I want you to focus on where the red arrows are on the page. The first arrow at the very top in the paragraph lists the people and the when. So the who and the when you can find at the beginning. So this will list the names of the grantors, who are the sellers of the property, the grantees, who are the purchasers, as well as the date and the type of transaction. The middle arrow at the middle of the slide points to the legal property description. You don't need to copy this down necessarily verbatim every single time, but if you are researching an older property, I would advise you to write it down at least once, because then you can see how that description may or may not have changed over time. And again, when you are looking at deeds at the courthouse, you're not going to find your current property address there. Everything will have a legal property description, such as Lot 18, Section 1 of Clarendon. So you need to be able to understand the different descriptions that are in the deed in order to help you find additional deeds. In the case of Broadview, that property description is quite lengthy. It talks about meets and bounds and rocks and fences and different boundary markers. But both those types of references are also very common. And again, it helps you figure out how a property has changed over time. The last arrow that's toward the bottom of that paragraph gives you clues as to where do you go next. More often than not, you'll see the next citation listed right there for you, saying something like the same property as conveyed to Mr. Smith from Mr. Jones in this deed book. I'd say more times than not, that information and that clue will be there waiting for you. All you have to do is copy it down. If you don't see it there, then that would require looking through some special index books that they have in the deed room to help you figure out where you go next. But make sure you at least try to pay attention and see if that clue is there for you. I also wanted to mention that oftentimes, not all the time, but a lot of times, if you turn the page, after you've read your deed reference and you turn the page, you very well might find the deed of trust, which is the mortgage document. And that would give you information about the financing for that particular transaction. And I'd also suggest that you pay attention to anything that you see handwritten in the margins of those deed book pages. You can find when mortgages were paid off. You can find names oftentimes, and also where different notices were mailed to the purchasers or sellers. Another resource available in the Land Records division of the courthouse are wills. And I wanted to show you a sample, and this is one having to do with the Broadview property. If you're interested in finding where someone was buried, there are a few very useful sources. These include the Find a Grave website, which you may or may not be familiar with. You can search by name and/or locality. There's a wonderful genealogical index to Arlington cemeteries that you can view here at the Center for Local History. And there are also wonderful sources of online obituaries and historic newspapers that you can find. And lastly, there are my favorite records, the census records. Here's a sample of the census listing from Broadview from 1880. So you can see Broadview's first owner, Robert Lacey, and we found this record through the free genealogy website familysearch.org. And as I mentioned earlier, you can do this on Ancestry.com, which is a paid subscription service, but you can also look up all the census records using your Arlington County Library card. When searching through the census, be patient and take advantage of the Zoom feature because a lot of these are handwritten and they're very difficult to read. Sometimes it's very easy to find exactly who you're looking for. I was researching my grandmother, and sure enough, there she was with my aunts and uncles. But sometimes not everyone's name was spelled correctly. Sometimes for whatever reason, things were surveyed out of order. So I would encourage you to think creatively when you're going through the census. Think of different spellings. If you're not finding the person who you're looking for, maybe look for another member, such as another family member, such as a spouse or a different relative, and see if you can find them that way. Census records are just a wonderful source of biographical information. Not only can you learn everyone's name in a household, you would learn their ages, their occupations, if they had any boarders or tenants living there, as well as where they were born, and places of residence over time. And the 1940 census is the most recent one that's available, and luckily in Virginia it is indexed. So if you haven't searched that yet, I would strongly encourage you to do so. And so before we leave Broadview, I just wanted to stress the importance of paying attention to the details as you're doing your research. Much like the historic paper trail, the buildings themselves hold all sorts of clues that can help you analyze and connect the puzzle pieces. The photo at the left, John and our staff took in the attic of Broadview. If you look very closely at the top of the picture, you can see remnants of the original I-house roof framing. It was amazing to notice that this still existed because it's been covered up for so long, and so it helped us piece together the evolution of the other sections of the house. And the photo on the right was taken and shared by one of the current property owners that shows the existing roof of the original house, and then that patched in area in the red circle shows where one of the original chimneys had been, and then they tried to fill it in. But you can still see the seam, and that provides us a clue to the original formation of the house. Okay, so let's quickly switch gears and dive into the mid-20th century, and we'll talk a little bit about Lustrons. And I'll have to confess up front, it's really hard for me to hide my enthusiasm about these houses, so I could probably talk on and on about them. But I wanted to include them here because they have such a different type of, there's a different paper trail you can find with researching a property like this, and I wanted to be able to walk you through that. So the house that I wanted to feature originally stood on South 12th Street. And like I said, it was built in 1949 and was one of 11 Lustrons that we had here in the county. They were the creative genius of Carl Strandland, who really thought that he could solve the national housing shortage by applying assembly line production methods to the housing construction industry. He really was ahead of his time and developed a very innovative prefab all-steel house. But unfortunately, the venture was very short-lived. There were only about 2,500 homes built in about an 18-month period between 1948 and 1950. And during some of my research for all of our Lustron work, I even discovered that Arlington has its own connection to the Lustron Corporation. Harold Denton, who had served as the company's marketing director, actually lived here in Arlington. He moved here in 1960 and stayed until he died in 2002. So we have our own connection there. The original owner of this property was Donald Wetmore, and although this home is no longer standing, it does have an exciting new life back in Ohio, where it came from. This is my favorite slide. Okay, so here are some wonderful photos that show you what a historic Lustron looked like. You can see at the upper left there the customized delivery truck that was packed at the factory in the order that you would need everything out at the building site. And then I just love the center photo that shows literally the thousands and thousands of house parts that comprise just one Lustron home. Lustrons offered 2 generously sized bedrooms, 1 bathroom, separate living and dining areas, radiant ceiling heating, a combination clothes and dishwasher. I'm not sure I would like one of those. I think those were very, very short-lived, and lots of built-in units and closet space. And all of this in under 1,100 square feet. They were cutting edge with sleek metal interiors that required only magnets for hanging up all your favorite photographs. And they were virtually maintenance-free with porcelain enamel exteriors that you could simply hose down, such as the woman in the heels and pearls is showing you there on the bottom photograph. And here's the original Lustron on 12th Street South. This is what it looked like just before it was donated to the county by then property owner Dr. Clifford Crown. I wanted to point out some of the original features, which is the open entry porch that has the funky, googie styled, as we call it, pier on the front porch. The built-in pass-through cabinet that you can see in that middle photograph that led from the dining room straight into the kitchen, as well as the built-in vanity that you can see in the master bedroom there on the bottom photograph. The 2 black and white photos on the slide were taken by the National Park Service's Historic American Building Survey as we were documenting the house before it was disassembled. And the Lustron logo on the right, every house had one of those. It was located in the utility room, and it let you know which one out of 2,500 your particular house was. If you want to learn more about some of the county's efforts to document and disassemble these houses, please see me. I could go on, but I won't here. But I did want to show you a few more photographs. The one at the left shows the donor of the property, Dr. Cliff Crown, when we interviewed him during the disassembly process. The middle shot shows opening night when we went to MoMA back in 2008. And then lastly is a now shot. This is what the house looks like now inside the Ohio History Connection, as it's now called, in Columbus. And it's part of an interactive exhibit where you can open drawers, peek in closets, and really experience how a family would have lived in America back in the 1950s. So if any of you ever go, I'd love to hear what you think about it. I haven't made it out there yet, one day. So here we have the house card for the Lustron house. And remember how when I showed you the card for Broadview, it barely had any information on it? Well, this one has all sorts of goodies that I wanted to show you. And because this house dated to 1949, we have the historic paper trail and permit record for this house. So here on the card, we can see the date the original building permit was approved, the names of both the original as well as subsequent owners, the name of the builder, the original construction permit number, as well as an alteration permit. So we really hit the jackpot. The whole card's filled out. I want to tell you that really the only place you can search these cards right now is at the Center for Local History, and the dedicated staff just loves it when people come inquire about it. But I was going to give you an insider's tip that the county's currently now trying to figure out how we can digitize some of these records and make these available online. So stay tuned. The most important items to record when you're looking for your building permit are the approval date in the upper corner and the building permit number that you find towards the bottom. And just so you know too, many of these cards continue onto more than one page. So if it says over, it's helpful to just make sure that you have both sides of the card. So here's what the card leads to. And this is an example of one of the county's historic original building permits. And these are now searchable on microfilm. And so in order for the library staff to help you find these, you would need to have, like I said, the building approval date as well as the actual permit number. So here we have, like I said, the original building permit. You can see the building permit number circled there at the top left, and this matches the number that we had on our house card. But other important information, you can see the name of the original owner, their address at that time, as well as the building contractor. And if this hadn't been a Lustron, most likely the architect, that information would have been filled out as well. The middle section of the card gives us a lot of the physical information about the property. What kind of house was it? Is it frame? Is it brick? What are the materials? How many rooms did it have? How many stories was it? And it also had an approximate building value. And so if you look very closely on this card, you can see the material line just simply says Lustron, and everyone knew what that meant. And then the bottom of the permit is shown on the right-hand side of the slide, and that gives additional information about the property, including the lot dimensions and the height and things like that. So with Lustrons in particular, there's a huge range of primary research material that's available, which means there's less legwork that you have to do in terms of finding your own primary research. So with Lustrons, there's great resources like the construction manual, which you can see the cover up there in the upper left. We also have copies of the original blueprints and the disassembly guide that the county put together back in 2007 when we were documenting the 12th Street South house. And as I mentioned too earlier, the Ohio History Connection in Columbus has the corporate archives collection for the Lustron company, so they have wonderful photographs and all sorts of other things. The neighborhood that this house used to be in, Virginia Heights, was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and I mention that because that means that that particular neighborhood has a comprehensive history that's already been compiled, so you wouldn't have to come up with any of that information on your own. That's available. And Arlington has over 17 single-family neighborhoods that are on the National Register, and all of the wonderful historic context and the importance and the significance of those neighborhoods, all that information has already been collected. So as you dive into your own research, hopefully you can use all the obvious sources, hopefully some of the ones that you've already know about and then others that you may have learned tonight, but I'm encouraging you to think outside the box. Make sure you're patient, and you really never know what you might uncover. Oh, and I did skip one thing. The information there in the middle is from the Social Security Death Index, and I did give you the website for that on one of the previous slides, so you can get information. It's an additional source for biographical information. So now, I know that was like the crash course, Historic House Research 101, but I tried to, hopefully, it's not as daunting. The process might not seem as daunting to you as it did when you first walked in the room. And I really would encourage you to find your stories for what interests you in the county. And we'd love to hear some of the fascinating things that you discover. So thank you.